An amazing archive of over 130 films made at the start of the 20th century and stored in a garage has been restored and saved by the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia. Enter a world of fantasy, romance, exotic lands and vivid reality. The Marvellous Corricks, a talented family of musical entertainers from New Zealand, first toured these silent films in the early 1900s. The films were uncovered in a garage in the Australian state of Tasmania many years later. Some of the oldest films in the world, thought lost, have now been found and restored. It's a window into life, over 100 years ago.
As film really entered the scene, they were there at the real turning point. They first bought a projector from a religious group and picked up pretty quickly that film being incorporated into the program was going to work really well for them.
And my father, being a visionary, we'll say, got their movie projector, and away went Leonard at the age of 14 and a half, the projectionist, or he was known as the mechanician.
We're certainly seeing that Leonard, as the budding cinematograph controller, was getting an instinct about the way film could be used. And with himself and his father making the selections, they began to build a really amazing collection of the short films that were being produced around the world. The Pathé films, many of them are what we loosely refer to as sort of the fantasy films, the ones which have wonderful stenciled colour and which generally feature the stories which are whimsical, sometimes completely berserk. There's one which ends up with a whole bunch of people and their heads turn into vegetables, nicely stenciled. Virtually all of the films will include what I always refer to as, the very happy, fat, dancing ladies. The film called La Peine du Talon, which means tit for tat in English, is a revenge film where basically the bugs get the revenge on the the bug catcher. And there the dancing is very theatrical, very much of the time, and I suppose something that you can look at and laugh about in one sense, but which is again a real window into the way that performance was actually presented at that time on stage, and how film incorporated literally theatre quite a lot for many years. Plus it's a lot of fun.
Within this collection, with all the French films, the American films and the British films, we can see real differences in what they were producing. The French ones are very, very sophisticated. They really are, in their chasing and how they develop characters, and they're not the same, but that helps you to understand the next film that comes along. You build that sort of knowledge as you're watching them. American films aren't quite as sophisticated. They clearly would come into their own much later. The English films similarly, clearly shot against theatrical flats outside, because sometimes you can actually see a shadow come over or things wobble a little bit so that you know that it's a theatrical flat. With the Australian films, with the Corrick films, they tend to be what we would call actuality.
Nitrate film was the first format used in commercial production. It was highly flammable and could decompose if kept in the wrong storage conditions.
In the 1960s, John Corrick realised that having 50,000 feet of nitrate film, some of it very smelly and congealed, in his garage wasn't a great safety feature for him or his family.
When I got to them, a few of them, probably 3 or 4 of the reels were solid celluloid blocks, and I figured just drop them on the floor and they might break in two or something. Fortunately, 90% of them have survived all right.
Watching the films took us to another land, another world. It was sort of like a fantasy land, and it was magical. It helped us develop our imaginations, and we'd go off and reenact the plays ourselves and pretend that we were in those films. The fellow with the horns who was pretending to be a bull, and it was just a magical, magical time of our lives.
John was very committed to the films as part of his family's history, and he heard that the National Library's film archive in those days might be interested. He contacted the National Library, and that was the beginning of what ended up being a 40-year saga in which the films were eventually placed with the National Film Archive, now the National Film and Sound Archive, and finally got preserved.
So I was extremely grateful to them and am now as being some means of preservation of those films.
The first stage in preserving each film is to repair all the physical damage, frame by frame, so that the film can be copied and shared with new audiences.
This one's got a lot of...
Some of these films were simple to repair, others took months.
What's the damage?
Well, there's a lot of crow's feet, as you can see here, the damage here with the crow's feet. Also, there's a lot of rips in it, which will take a lot of work to repair, and it's also very brittle. Because they were stored in Tasmania, they were in quite good condition. Now, I'm glad they weren't in the tropics, like in Queensland, because, as you know, we've had quite a few films from Queensland. They're only 20-odd years old, and they were pretty badly decomposed. Some of them were quite brittle. This one isn't. Some of them you couldn't even bend like this. This is beautiful. You could bend it beautifully because as it goes through the projector, it's got to bend quite a bit. Looks magnificent, just like it was made yesterday. This is totally unrestored, original nitrate. I'm sure it would have been screened hundreds, probably tens of hundreds of times, and it's still in magnificent condition.
The National Film and Sound Archive and the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery in Launceston have the privilege of really representing and preserving the full story of the Corrick family entertainers through the wonderful film collection, through the scrapbooks, the personal correspondence, the promotional material and the photographs that the Corricks generated themselves. Film for nitrate stills and is very similar to film for moving picture in that the quality of nitrate film has a particular warmth and richness to it. You literally want to dive into the pictures. They are so alive and just embracing the moment, and virtually you can feel them, how they must have actually been experiencing being in parts of the world that nobody in those days would familiarly have been travelling to. But also thinking about the family, this sort of travel, getting onto a boat, actually having to work throughout the year or more that they were away, arriving in places where they don't know the customs, delivering not only to the Anglo audience that might be there, but to the population in general, and getting out and about. So I don't know how long they'd have to use to rehearse. They must have known their program inside out. But getting out and about, touring around, being surrounded by kids. In this particular one, this is the Chinese schoolyard. Being surrounded by the locals, getting right into it. It's not like the touring of the Raj or whatever. These are people who are actually getting out into life in the streets. It's amazing.
Colour in the nitrate era was a strong feature of even the earliest film productions. Accurately reproducing those colours was one of the archive's big challenges.
Colour has been a difficult thing to deal with because you can't reproduce those colours anymore, because with the tints and the tones and the stenciling, the dyes that they used were full of things like uranium and cadmium and things that would kill you. So they're replicated in a process called desmet, which is a colouring process which is done in the print, not in the negative. And in other instances where a film is totally coloured from beginning to end, we've made a colour print on colour stock. In 1 year we decided, well, we can do the tinting, which is one colour spread across the frames of film. It's not stenciling where there's multiple colours. And it was another small revelation. We all got really excited about it and started talking about what colours we could use. We used colour charts from the period and researched it and found all the chemistry behind it. So when we first did it, we had a variety of the reds. We had a variety of orange reds, pink reds and red. And the red was red, you know. And that's the colour that we've stuck with in terms of the reds. With this collection, the Corrick collection, what we've really got is an incredible gauge of what people were seeing around the country, whether it be in country areas or in the big cities, as well as overseas. We think of this era, the 1900s, as being, you know, so far back. They didn't have colour, they didn't have this, they didn't have that, and it was so primitive. But in fact, you know, even back in the 1890s and onwards, they had colour. It was painted onto the film, into the prints, you know, in a different way, using chemicals that, well, we know that they glow in the dark. So this is what these films did. You project them, and the colour that you see is so sumptuous. In this huge collection, there have been lots of little finds. One of the ones that we got most excited about was Living London.
We had just a wonderful moment of opportunity when we had a visiting British early cinema specialist. We showed him the film and he got incredibly excited because he was able to identify that it was this particular film, which isn't known to exist anywhere else in the world.
Thought lost forever. The English just thought it was the bee's knees.
If you look at the film and you think about, I suppose, documentary filmmaking now, and you think about what wasn't even called documentary in 1904, what is spectacular about the filming is that it's very modern, it's very detailed.
You know, it's a window into our past through their eyes as much as it is through our eyes. And I've read in various places that the audiences would become so engaged with it that they would go just to see a particular scene and call out, "Oi!" And the person, you know, or she would turn around and she'd be looking straight at them. So they'd interact with the film that way, which is just amazing to be sitting in an audience because they weren't quiet, there's no sound, so people were talking all the way through it.
With the restoration of the Corrick collection, modern audiences can experience life and entertainment the way it was over 100 years ago, a world that no longer exists. It reveals how the new art form was loved by audiences from the start and how the magic of film became essential in our lives.